Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of A Game in a Chair brought to you by the American Civil War Gaming Club. My name is Blake, I'm the host here on this show. If you'd like to learn more about our club, you can go to acwgc.net for more information. Today we're going to be looking at another of the optional rules that we play with in these Civil War games. And today we're going to concentrate on Density Fire Modifier. This is something that probably everyone checks by default, and there's good reasons why they do that. But I don't really know if people understand what exactly this rule does, other than what it says it does, which is create a modifier which increases the damage against overstacked hexes with too many infantry or cavalrymen in them. So let's talk a little bit more about what this optional rule really does and why it is important. To start with, here is the definition given to us by WDS. Select Density Fire Modifier to have fire against a target hex with more than 2/3 of the maximum stacking increased. This increase is proportional to the stacking value up to a maximum of 150% at maximum stacking. So let's start at the beginning and ask ourselves why this rule exists in the first place. As with most things in the WDS games, they exist for realism purposes and also gaming purposes. With the Density Fire Modifier and realism, it's pretty simple to understand. If you are a soldier and you are firing against a line with this many troops, there's a lot of space in there which you could miss. So it seems pretty obvious that when there are not too many men in a hex, you're going to have a harder time hitting someone. However, once that hex begins to fill up, you can hardly help but miss them. And that's what this rule does. The more men that there are in a hex, the less the probability is that you will miss them. And so casualties will be increased the more men that you have in a hex. So from a realism standpoint, it's pretty easy to understand why this rule exists and what its purpose is. Now switching over to the gaming argument as to why this rule exists, one of the easiest tactics in the game to understand and perform is the simple large stack attack. And this is just when you fill as many men as you can into a single hex, make it as close to 1,000 as possible, and charge against your enemy. And the argument existed that there was no reason to not max stack all of your hexes, because whether you had 100 men in the hex or 1,000 men in the hex, the enemy could only inflict X number of casualties. Therefore, you might as well stack up your hexes and create as much firepower against the enemy as possible. But with the addition of this optional rule to the games, this tactic has become counteracted to some extent. Now when you cram as many men as possible into a single hex, you're going to suffer increased losses and other side effects which I don't know if people really take into consideration. So there is a downside to max stacking hexes that does not exist if you uncheck this rule. Let me give you some basic examples here. If you have 350 men rated B, and you are firing against 1,000 men in an enemy hex, with the rule turned off, the 38th Georgia here would inflict 23 casualties on average against their opponents. However, with the rule turned on, they will average 35 losses against their opponents because of the density modifier. And that is simply because of the Density Fire Modifier. That increases the fire value of units firing into these large stacks and increases their damage by up to 150%. And this rule works perfectly as designed. If you are firing into a overstacked hex, you're going to do more damage. And I think everyone pretty much was in agreement that there should be some logic behind the idea that if you fired into a thick mass of men, it would almost be impossible to miss them. And thus the number of casualties in large stacks should be increased. And this rule really has become standard in every game I think we play in the American Civil War Gaming Club, and I think it always will be like that. This is one of those rare occasions where the game developers and the gamers, everyone just seemed to agree that this rule made sense, and I really can't think of an argument not to use it. When you look at how the rule affects things, though, there are other parts of it which bear discussing. With the rule turned off, as I said before, in my example, those 350 men would inflict 23 average losses on a 1,000 man hex, whereas with the rule turned on, those same 350 men will inflict about 35 casualties on that same stack. That's an increase of 50%. Now when you go down the line between 900 and 800 and 700 man stacks, again, with the rule turned off, the average is going to remain the same in the left-hand column because there's no modifier at work. Whereas in the right-hand column, if there are 700 men, the average losses will be 24 because there's a 5% increase because of the Density Fire Modifier. With 800 men, there is a 20% increase, which means 28 men on average will become casualties in an 800 stack. And with a 900 stack, there will be 31 average casualties, which is a 35% increase. So the rule works as intended. But it doesn't really seem to matter all that much. I mean, 23 versus 35 casualties, 35 is nice, but it doesn't really seem like it's that big of a deal. But that's just the average. You might be above that, you might be below that, so that's just the average. But there's something here that people often forget, which is a side effect of having larger casualties. And that is morale checks. Very often, people put morale checks in the back of their mind and don't think about them actively as they're playing. But remember, when a unit suffers casualties due to combat, morale checks may be applicable. And this is determined based on a probability using the given loss, as loss divided by loss plus 25. Yes, I know we all love math, but there is some math here. Now let me give you an example here of whether or not a morale check would occur. So in the column on the left, in each instance, there is a 48% chance that the unit that loses 23 men will be forced to take a morale check. And if they pass that morale check, great. They're disrupted. It's not the end of the world. They aren't routing away. However, if they lose that morale check, they will rout and they will disrupt everyone around them. So it is a big deal when you have a morale check. Now, in the column on the right, with the Density Fire Modifier, that's going to create heavier losses, which, of course, increases the probability of morale checks. As a matter of fact, if you have a 1,000 man stack and they lose 35 men in one of those units, there's a 58% chance that they are going to have to take a morale check. And just all the way down the line, there is an increased probability of having a morale check because of the heavier losses. And remember once again that these are just averages. So although on paper, the enemy might only be losing a few extra men, they are also increasing the odds of a morale check. Remember, overstacking hexes past 666 men, which should be an easy number to remember, equals increased losses, and also increased number of morale checks. And like I said, morale checks lead to disruptions, they lead to lower fire values being fired back at the enemy, and once you are disrupted, you have an inability to melee, which means too many morale checks can cause an attack to be completely defanged because the enemy can't melee, their fire values are cut in half, and they're suffering disruptions and possible routes. So stacking one hex with more than 666 men can be a risky proposition. So as far as the density modifier goes, should you use the rule or not? Absolutely, you should be using this rule because it makes sense. It is one of the ways in which WDS evens out two imbalanced forces. Without using this rule, the side with more men will have an advantage in being able to max stack their hexes without any sort of penalty for doing so. And that would give them an advantage. So this helps, like I said, balance everything out within the WDS game. Alright everybody, thank you for watching as always. I do hope you appreciate it and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to like this video. When you do that, it helps our algorithm and gets us recommended to other Civil War gamers out there. You can also subscribe, and you can check out everything we have going on in the American Civil War Gaming Club. Until next time everybody, just remember, keep gaming.